Today on Blue 58, the Packers had a strong finish to the 2023 season, especially on offense, but we have good reason to think they could be even better in 2024.
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I am your host, John Meerdink, and I am happy to be with you here for another episode. Happy, first and foremost, because I got to do a fun follow-up from the last episode. I mentioned either in the last episode or one relatively recently that there were other Packers podcasts out there, even in other languages. I mentioned a Japanese language Packers podcast and a Russian podcast. I was not able to track down the Packers podcast in Japanese that I was thinking of. It's possible I was misremembering it. That was a couple of years ago. However, thanks to a listener in the Blue 58 Power Sweep Discord, we were able to track down a Japanese language football podcast called The Football Swamp.
Hope you're having a good day. It's time for the Ame Futo Numa podcast, and it's time for another episode. This is Ame Futo Numa podcast.
今年のドラフトはですね、本当見るだけで楽しもうかなというふうに思ってたんですね。
I'll cut our esteemed host off there because I don't speak Japanese. If you do, you can fill me in on what he was saying there. But it's just cool to see that there are Packers podcasts going on in other languages. And, of course, the Russian language podcast still going out there, referring to themselves as, well, see if you can see what it's called.
Всем привет! В эфире Green 19, подкаст восточноевропейских фанов Green Bay Packers о нашей любимой команде. Сегодня в эфире я, ваш хост Андрей Гордиенко, и у меня в гостях большой дружный коллектив. Во-первых, наш со-хост, хост Зума Алексей Дзюба. Леша, здравствуй. Как там погодка в Питере?
Погодка прекрасная. Всем привет.
The Green 19 podcast. I don't know if you caught it in there, but that was in English. They've also got a nice intro to that podcast that I did not play. Didn't want to get copyright struck because they use some NFL Films audio in there. But it was cool to listen to. I actually had a little bit of that podcast playing when I was working on some stuff at work yesterday. And it's funny, even going from Russian to English, I don't speak Russian either, but you can feel the rhythm of a sports podcast even in a different language. It all kind of feels the same, no matter what language you're speaking. Sports talk is sports talk. So if you're out there and you're producing a podcast in another language, give us a shout. We'll give you a shout out on the show. And just keep doing great work. Every Packers podcaster out there, whether you're in English or Japanese or Russian or something else, just you're doing great work. In terms of last podcast, there was something else I wanted to follow up on as well. I've been noodling on this idea of positive regression a little bit. Just things returning a little bit more toward what you would expect, or maybe just trending a little bit more toward average from being on the below end of average before. With some slight tweaks, I think we could see that in a couple other areas, particularly on defense for the Packers. So let's focus on the defense a little bit. The reason, well, first and foremost, just some background. The reason that I'm so high on this concept is a couple things. There is a long history in football of improving by just stopping your practice of the bad things. Stop devoting resources to things that are not helping you. Bill Walsh was a big proponent of this with the San Francisco 49ers. I think it was in his book. It may have been a different source. But he, through the work of some of his assistant coaches, including Mike Holmgren, who would go on to coach the Packers, they discovered one key instance of this, and they discovered that a good portion of Joe Montana's interceptions came on one particular play. And Walsh's solution to that was just very simple. Well, let's stop running that play. They did, and the offense got better as a result. I think that is a micro example of a macro trend in football, where resources are limited. You can only have a certain number of guys in the field. You're only going to play a certain number of plays per game. One of the quickest ways to improve is either getting better players or spending fewer of the plays that you have on the bad players. In 2019, from 2019 through to 2020, we saw a really good example to this. The Packers spent like 118 targets of their passing game in 2019, throwing to Jimmy Graham and Geronimo Allison. I think both of those players had their merits, but in 2019 with the Packers, they were not especially good. So I hypothesized heading into 2020 that the Packers' offense would improve just by virtue of the fact that they weren't going to be burning more than 100 targets. That's like 2 to 3, more than 3 a game, more than 4 a game, more than 5 a game, actually, on Jimmy Graham and Geronimo Allison. And I don't know if there was a one-to-one relationship, but things definitely improved. The Packers stopped just wasting plays on guys that weren't helping them and spent them on guys that were going to help them. And I think there's a couple examples where we can see that play out on the Packers defense this year. The first is just getting Devondre Campbell off the field. Now, I think Devondre Campbell had a lot of positive things to do in Green Bay. In 2021, he was obviously very good. In 2022, I think he was better than people give him credit for. But for 2023, things were not great for Campbell on the field. For injury reasons, for agreeing with the coach reasons, any way you want to slice it, it was not a good year for him in 2023. Just taking him out of the mix on defense, I think, will lead to a net improvement on the defense regardless of who else you put in there. It will force you to do some different things. It'll get you away from playing Devondre Campbell, and that should be a step in the right direction as a result. In addition to that, I think whether it's Campbell or somebody else, the Packers have a better linebacker depth chart 2 through 4 this year, even without seeing a couple of these guys on the field, than they did last year. So last year, your linebackers 2 through 4 on the depth chart were Devondre Campbell, Isaiah McDuffie, and Eric Wilson. Now, I've already defended Campbell prior to 2023. I think I'm a pretty significant fan of Isaiah McDuffie, and I'm probably higher on Eric Wilson on defense than most. But I think having Edgerrin Cooper, Isaiah McDuffie, and Teron Hopper is a better trio behind Quay Walker than Campbell, McDuffie, and Wilson. That doesn't seem super controversial to me. That's a more athletic group. That's a younger group. That should be a more durable group. It should be a better group blitzing. That feels like a net improvement. And Eric Wilson is still around. So if you really wanted to get him out there too, it just shows the depth chart has improved. That is, I think, a positive regression there as well. You're going to be spending your linebacker snaps on whoever is behind Quay Walker or next to, or playing next in the linebacker pecking order behind Quay Walker, on better players than you were on average in 2023. That seems like an improvement as well. Then, in probably our most one-to-one example between the Jimmy Graham, Geronimo Allison example from 2019 that I used, in 2023, the Packers spent nearly 2,000 snaps with Jonathan Owens, Rudy Ford, and Darnell Savage on the field. Combined, they played nearly 2,000 snaps, 1,959 to be precise. Not having any of those guys on the field is probably a net improvement, and I'm a big fan, I think, of Rudy Ford. But not just taking those guys off the field, but replacing them with 3 at least better prospects. Xavier McKinney is better than any of those guys. Javon Bullard should be in the conversation to be as good as any of those guys, even as a rookie. And between Evan Williams and Kitano Ladapo, you should be able to find somebody else to fill in those snaps, to say nothing of Anthony Johnson Jr., better than Owens, Ford, and Savage could last year. Shoot, by the end of the year, Anthony Johnson was getting snaps ahead of Rudy Ford, next to Owens and Savage. So just spending resources on defense on different players than you did in 2023 probably will help the Packers head in the right direction in 2024. I think that's a fairly safe thing to say, but it's worth calling out these specific examples as we start really pointing our attention toward the 2024 season. A couple questions I want to take from listeners before we get into the main thing that I wanted to talk about today. First up, MacMiller6914 asks in our Discord server, how much did the hip tackle rule change or impact how teams approached the draft, or was it just a weak defensive draft class? This is an interesting question because I don't think, much like the kickoff rule, we fully know the implications of the hip drop tackle rule. We haven't really discussed that on the podcast that much. Go look up the explainers on it. They're out there. Even from the NFL themselves, the NFL Game Operations Committee or whatever it is. But basically, there's going to be different penalties in play for how you tackle players, trying to make the game a little bit safer. I'm skeptical of that part of it. I think just the optics are bad from a couple of injuries. That generally is how these sort of things go. But I think in terms of what affected the draft on the field, a single offseason of rule changes probably doesn't change things all that much in terms of how teams are thinking about their philosophy. I think this past draft class is going to be an interesting case in the value of offense versus defense and whether or not teams were right to do that. So almost any way you slice it, this was a very offensive-heavy draft. The great example from the first round was just 6 quarterbacks going in the first 12 picks. That's crazy and unheard of. But teams are spending a lot of resources on the offensive side of the ball, which pushed a lot of defense further down the draft board, which I think helped the Packers in at least a couple of instances. I wonder if in a more normal year they could get Edgerrin Cooper and Javon Bullard in the second round. Gut feeling is in a more typical year, they probably get one or the other of those guys, just depending how things break. But things went very offense heavy in the first round, and that pushed a lot of defense down the board to the Packers, which helps a lot, at least in theory. Analytically, though, this does make some sense regardless of how things play out here. Pro Football, not Pro Football Focus, Football Outsiders, back before the demise of their site, hypothesized that a defense essentially amounts to, I think I've got these ratios right, basically 4 parts offense, 3 parts defense, and 1 part special teams. Offense is more valuable than defense, and both of them are more valuable than special teams, and you should allocate your resources accordingly. That, I think, is what we saw in the draft this year, and time is only going to tell whether or not that was a good idea, but we've got a pretty good example here of teams skewing really hard toward, let's get some offense here. Let's make sure that we take care of our skill positions, our quarterbacks, our offensive line, and make sure that we handle it early and often, and then see about defense later on. I don't know exactly how we would measure that trend on a league-wide level, but we can certainly keep an eye on it in terms of how it affected the Packers, because the Packers got one of the more higher-end offensive linemen. Boy, that was a weirdly constructed sentence. They got a higher-end offensive lineman, though not the tip-top. And then they got 2 pretty solid defensive players, maybe not blue chippers, but pretty close to top-tier defenders in the second round, toward the middle and later portions of the second round even, because in part those offensive players went early. So it did affect the Packers, and it could be a benefit to the Packers in the short and long term. The Jet Sweep guy asks, who do you think our top wide receivers in yards will be, and what order do you predict they finish in? Went back and forth on this, and I think my top 3 in order in terms of yards are going to be Jayden Reed, Christian Watson, and Dontavian Wicks. Let me talk through my thought process here. Jayden Reed was their leading receiver last year, and I think he's going to have every opportunity to be their volume guy this year. I think Reed is an interesting player because he seems to profile as someone who can be both a volume player and a fairly explosive receiver as well. So he's good in the slot, he's good in short area stuff, but he might be able to handle a pretty heavy workload too, so you might see a lot of Jayden Reed and the Packers offense in the very near future. Christian Watson, if he's healthy, is going to be near the very top. I think he could push Reed for the top if he stays healthy, just because of how he gets yards relative to everyone else. There's no one like Christian Watson on the Packers roster. He gets yards in chunks in ways that no one else, when he is healthy, is able to replicate. Reed cannot do it. Dontavian Wicks cannot do it. Romeo Doubs cannot do it. And then I've got Dontavian Wicks as the third guy, bumping ahead of Doubs, I think just for some redundancy reasons. I think Doubs, I'm probably higher on Doubs than most Packers analysts out there. I think when he's in the right situation, he's a very useful player for the Packers to have. And he showed it down the stretch last year. The last third of the season and into the playoffs was, I think, the epitome of what I want to see from Romeo Doubs. He is never the top guy. He like yardage-wise, he may end up being the top guy in a couple of situations, but he's never the focal point of the offense. But he is the sort of guy who takes advantage of seeing matchups with second and third cornerbacks or safeties or linebackers or whatever, and finds a way to get open beyond that. He strikes me as a very smart player, a very instinctive player, and that is the sort of player that I think you want out there in those situations where it's just sort of a feel situation. And Doubs does seem to have a really good feel for the game, and I think we saw that in a couple of the plays that he put up against both the 49ers and the Cowboys in the playoffs. Now, I have him behind Wicks because I think Wicks is going to eventually take some of Doubs' opportunities. I think he's a more impactful player on a down-to-down basis. I would lean a little bit more toward him body type-wise even, and I think he's probably got a higher ceiling than Doubs, and I think he's going to end up jumping ahead of Doubs on the receiver depth chart or pecking order or however you want to put it here, and get more of the attention than Doubs does, but I think it's going to be close. So it's going to be Reed, Watson, and Wicks in order if I had to guess. That could change, but that seems like a pretty good guess right here toward the end of May. Finally, Old Packers fan asks, any thoughts on David Bakhtiari potentially returning to the Packers or the NFL? I can't see a circumstance where he returns to the Packers except for several in-season injuries and an obvious hole at left tackle. I think you're right on that, Reed. I don't really see a circumstance, even if things went really sideways at tackle for the Packers, that David Bakhtiari would be back. It seems like it doesn't seem like the relationship is super sour. It just seems like that chapter has closed, put it that way. I think both sides were ready for something different here, and I think having Bakhtiari back in the locker room at this point probably gives the Packers some storylines they would just rather not explore, especially if he ends up playing better than somebody that you had or needed him to replace. That would be a little bit unfortunate, but you take a good player where you can get one. I don't think the Packers are going to court that storyline. Now, I do think Bakhtiari is going to play in the NFL this season. I think just there is a premium on offensive linemen out there. You need good ones. And Bakhtiari, when healthy, even over the past 3 years, has been very good. When he has been healthy, when he's been able to be on the field, you can't really argue with the quality of play. It's just that the availability has been an issue. And if he has put that behind him, if his knee is really good to go, there's really no reason for someone not to sign him because he can play. He's going to be a studious player. He always has been. But it's just a matter of whether or not that knee is good to go. If it is, someone should sign him, and he can give you some quality snaps if it holds up. If it's not, then he won't end up in the NFL, but I think there's a good chance that he does this season. Before we get to my final topic that I wanted to talk about today, another shout-out for our Patreon and our paid Substack subscription, patreon.com/thepowersweep, and thepowersweep.substack.com. You help us keep this show ad-free, and as we had somebody point out in our Discord server recently, keeping things ad-free is a good way to keep the show shorter. The shorter, the fewer ads that you have in a show, the less incentive you have to keep the show just going and going and going, so you can stuff in more ads. And I like to keep these shows fairly short, and I don't know if pithy is the right word, but brisk, put it that way. Research has showed that the average commute in the United States is about 25 minutes, so if we shoot for that 20 to 30-minute range, I give you a nice show that you can listen to on your drive to and from work. I don't want you to have to come back for 2 or 3 sessions to get through an entire episode. I hate doing that. I want to give you something you can listen to relatively quickly, and not having ads is a good way to do that. So if you want to help us keep this show ad-free, not threatening that there would ever be ads, but your support does go a long way to help us keep things running, patreon.com/thepowersweep or thepowersweep.substack.com. Any number or any level of support, either of those places, you only get one level on Substack, but that's the way things go, gets you into our Discord server. And also, if you support at certain levels, you'll get some free merch from the Power Sweep as well. So check out both of those options and help us keep doing what we're doing here. All right, I wanted to conclude today by talking about explosive plays. This is something we've tracked at the Power Sweep for most of a decade now. I can't remember if we had a devoted page for it in our first season back in 2016, but for a long time, certainly I think since 2018, we've had a week-by-week count of what the Packers do in explosive plays. And I've expanded out my personal database of this just so I have data to look at back to 1994, exploring what the Packers do for explosive plays. What is an explosive play? There are different definitions. Different coaches use different definitions. Matt LaFleur, I think, refers to all plays of 15 yards or more as explosive plays. Some people say 20 yards or more. The common NFL definition that I've had that dates back to Mike Ayers with the Packers in the early 2000s and maybe even Brian Billick elsewhere before that is a run of at least 12 yards or more and a pass of at least 16 yards or more. If you get those, you're more likely to score on a given drive than you are otherwise. It's intuitively true. It is supported analytically. If you move the ball in chunks, you have a better chance of scoring. The better you do that, the better your offense is. So I wanted to talk about that, starting with Aaron Jones. My initial theory, looking at, just thinking about this before I started looking at the numbers, was that the Packers would have a lot of work to do, both at running back and in their offense in general, in replacing Aaron Jones and the explosive plays that he brought. That is not quite true. He did not actually have that many explosive plays in 2023. He had 2 in week 1 and then none until week 15 as he dealt with injury stuff throughout the season. Then he had 9 in the final 4 games of the regular season to finish the 2023 season with 11. A couple more in the playoffs, but we don't count those. keeping some uniformity with how the NFL does things in terms of their counting stats for a given season. So just 11 explosive plays for Aaron Jones last year. That means the Packers don't technically have much work to do to replace him. But that opens the door, I think, to talk about the Packers' explosiveness on offense in general and how they're trending in the Matt LaFleur era. Generally speaking, explosive plays have been pretty consistent and almost flat, I would say, across the Matt LaFleur era. In 2019, they had 107. They jumped up to 111 in 2020, then 112 in 2021. They were down to 108 in 2022, but then back up to 114 in 2023. It's good to have more, and 114 is certainly an impressive number. It's worth remembering that they got more games starting with the 2021 season, but not a ton of variation. And I think looking at those numbers, it shows you how efficient they were in the 2020-2021 seasons more than just being explosive. You had an MVP quarterback, you had Devontae Adams playing as well as he has ever played, and you had Aaron Jones probably at the peak of his powers in those seasons, and they weren't putting up just incredible numbers of explosive plays. If you want incredible numbers, look at 2011, 2014, and even 2013. They had 143, 133, and 128 explosive plays in those seasons, respectively. That is an explosive offense for the Packers. Incidentally, 2023 is a sneaky missed opportunity season. The Packers' defenses in 2012 through 2014 were better than people give them credit for. And they still managed 128 explosive plays despite Aaron Rodgers being out for much of the 2013 season with a broken collarbone. They got beat at home by the 49ers in the cold at a game I was actually at in 2013. So January 2014, they went home in the cold there. But I think the Packers were a better team that year than people gave them credit for, and maybe were just a healthy Aaron Rodgers away from a potentially deep playoff run. And then we saw how 2014 played out. I think a lot of the returning pieces from 2013 were a big part of that 2014 season, which of course came up short as well, but we don't have to reopen that wound. Anyway, I think these explosive play numbers are actually a big reason for optimism this season. There are a couple things that I think point us in that direction. First and foremost is going to be better health from both Christian Watson and Luke Musgrave. We are assuming a lot saying Christian Watson is going to be healthy, considering he really hasn't been healthy for either of his two NFL seasons to date. I don't think we're assuming that much, though, to say that Luke Musgrave is probably not going to rupture his spleen again. But if both Watson and Musgrave could be healthy this year, those are two big explosive play assets that the Packers would have on the field that they didn't consistently have on the field last year. Christian Watson's explosive play totals dropped last year, though not by much, from 11 to 10, so he still put up quite a few explosive plays, even though he wasn't healthy for much of the season. And Luke Musgrave contributed 7, even though he too was not healthy for a good chunk of the season. That, I think, is a very encouraging data point as to what the Packers could potentially put up in 2024. The other thing that we really have to consider here is Josh Jacobs and Marshawn Lloyd. Josh Jacobs is pretty close to a one-to-one replacement in terms of Aaron Jones' explosive play output. Surprising to me, maybe surprising to you as well. But in 2019, he put up a pretty good number of explosive plays, and that's continued since then. 2019, it was 3 receiving, 22 rushing for 25 total. 2020, 3 receiving, 24 rushing, 27 total. 2021 jumps all the way up to 5 receiving explosive plays, though just 13 rushing, so 18 total. 2022, his best season so far, he had 3 through the air and 31 on the ground, 34 total, better than any season from Aaron Jones that I've got on record. And then in 2023, another down season, 3 receiving and 6 rushing, so for 9 total. If he's healthy, again, we said that now for 3 players on their offense, but if he is healthy, and if he produces how the Packers think that he can, there's no reason he can't be at least or perhaps better than a one-to-one replacement for Aaron Jones. Then you've got Marshawn Lloyd in the backfield as well. He is almost assuredly more explosive than any number 2 back the Packers have had since 2017. I picked that because that was the year Aaron Jones was drafted. I'm not saying he was the number 2 back then, but he was pretty close to it early in his career. Technically, you could say that he was. But basically, since then, there hasn't been anybody in the backfield other than Aaron Jones that has the explosive qualities even comparable to an Aaron Jones. Jacobs should be able to duplicate what Jones did in terms of volume, and I think Lloyd gives the Packers more juice at backup running back or at number 2 running back than they've had in the relatively recent past. A.J. Dillon has never been a big explosive play producer. So if they can upgrade that part of their backfield at all, I think there's a lot of reason to think this could be a much more explosive Packers offense. Just like by the numbers, they should be producing a higher volume of explosive plays than we've seen in the Matt LaFleur era to this point. And then on top of all that, you've got a quarterback who's going from being in year 1 of starting to year 2 of starting. And if you look at how their explosive plays chart over the course of the season, you do get some good games early in the year last year. But it's kind of a roller coaster on the chart. You're up one week, you're down the next week, you're up the week after that. The back half of the season, they started producing explosive plays at a higher and higher rate, or more and more consistently, put it that way. That alone should make us optimistic that this can be a much more explosive offense in 2024 than really that we've seen in the Matt LaFleur era to date. And that would be an interesting change from Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers, in his late career version, was not a fast break point guard type quarterback. He was more the methodical half-court offense, dime dropper, put it that way. He wasn't the guy that was running the length of the floor. They weren't running high-tempo stuff. He was just trying to be methodical and precise, and at his best those years, it was incredible to watch how precise, and I think Bob McGinn even said professorial he could be at the line, and that's just a great line for how Rodgers played those years. But it was not as explosive as even what we saw from the Packers offense in 2023, and I think we're going to get an interesting contrast in the types of offense that can work with the Packers if we see a more explosive offense for them in 2024 than we saw in the late Rodgers era, as exciting as that was. And that is a very tantalizing and exciting possibility for the Packers and for Packers fans. That's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you tuning in. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. It's going to help more people find the show and get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.